So when a particular critic that most of you know went on his program and said, oh, this is where Gary Habermas is going to tell us about his 250 people he interviewed for The Empty Tomb. That's what we're going to find in this third volume.
What kind of jerk would possibly have said that? The third volume will be his research, so he interviewed 250 scholars. He will finally publish a detailed analysis of that. Oops, that was me.
Just out of curiosity, who was that critic that you had in mind there? So
I probably would rather not use the name on the air.
It's okay. You can say my name, Gary.
Say my name.
And just in case anybody wonders, it's not a well-known scholar. It's a popularist. Let's say that.
Just give us his initials. That's all we need, Gary.
You know who he is.
Gary's got us in suspense now for the rest of the show.
Yeah, maybe he'll reveal it at the end as a bonus. But all right,
off the air.
Welcome to Paulogia, where a former Christian takes a look at the claims of Christians. For 5 years or so, I've been interacting with the work of resurrection scholar Gary Habermas.
There's only one person who knows more about the resurrection of Jesus than Gary, and that's Jesus.
As you can tell from the intro, Gary is also watching my work, even though he doesn't want to admit it. For the past 15 years, Gary has been working on his 4-volume, 4,000-page, so-called magnum opus book series called On the Resurrection. The first 2 volumes came out last year, and I've spoken about them here on the channel. And while frustratingly, the Canadian retailers do not yet have copies to send me, Volume 3 was officially released last week. To mark the occasion, a disciple of Gary's decided to have a bit of a live stream party.
I'm doing a special for Gary Habermas, a celebration show to honor his legacy and the fact that he just finished his 4-volume work on the evidence for the resurrection. In fact, today he's just published his 3rd volume of his 4-volume magnum opus on the historical evidence for the resurrection. And that's why we're here today with the other panelists and resurrection experts to speak about that and celebrate that.
Regular viewers may recognize Dr. Mike Licona and Dr. Sean McDowell. In the bottom left is Dr. Ben Shaw, who's been Gary's main research assistant for this book project. And in the bottom middle is Dr. Tony Costa from Toronto Apologetics, whom I'm encountering for the first time. Before we get to the multi-hour tribute to Gary, let's take a quick look at what we know about this freshly released Volume 3 and the egregious misrepresentation made by me who shall not be named that got Gary so flustered.
Obviously, you have 4 volumes that are coming out. This isn't just a one-and-done book. This is covering all of your research. And just for the audience, do you want to kind of very briefly summarize what each of those volumes are about and what people can expect to find in them?
That the first volume is on evidence. The second volume is called Refutations. With Volume 3, people will find this out soon enough. But Volume 3, I make a break with the apologetics, per se. And I'm basically, there's more in the world than just apologetics. Volume 3 is on scholarly perspectives, and it's a who's who of people with terminal degrees in relevant fields.
Maybe it was by design, or maybe I've just been slow to understand. But from my perspective, Gary has always been somewhat vague on exactly what is going to be in Volume 3. I've never had particular clarity. Here's how Gary described the 3rd volume during his Volume 1 promotion tour.
Okay.
Volume 3 started out as 1,500 pages.
Wow.
And we've honed it down to about 800. And it is a who's who of liberal, all the way to very liberal atheist New Testament scholars, all the way to very conservative New Testament writers with credentials. Very conservative, but PhD. And what we did was try to survey about 140. My research assistant said it's more like 200. He said he's the one that typed it up. About 140 questions minimum from Good Friday to the Ascension. So you got about 40 days here. And think of all the questions you could ask. Why the 3rd day? How did Jesus appear? What's our earliest evidence? Every question you can think of. And all we do in Volume 3 is not argue for anything. We give a landscape view from really liberal to really conservative.
And then describing it this way during his Volume 2 tour.
The 3rd volume is a research volume. We don't engage in the views. I say we. my longtime research assistant, Ben Shaw, I gathered, well, it's Ben's figure, 95% of the data. Ben edited it by retyping. We had to cut down from 1,500 to about 1,000 pages for volume 3. But it's a who's who on where people are on key resurrection questions. Almost never do we jump in and give a view of our view. If they teach, we have a section, hallucinations. You teach hallucinations, you go down to hallucinations. We don't bicker with you.
And here's Ben, the editor of the book, talking about it.
What about the third volume? What's in the third volume?
Is going to be, so Habermas has referenced how he tracks a lot of scholars. This is going to be a lot of scholars who he's tracked over the years, and I've worked on this, on portion of this document for the past decade. He's worked on it since 1975. So I jumped in about a decade ago and added to it. And it is a collection of where scholars are on all these different subjects. So it's not really too much of his thoughts, but it's really highlighting where we put these people in these thoughts.
In hindsight, I now know why they're struggling to communicate what this book is. Because now that I've seen it, I get how bewildering the concept of this book is. Later in the video, I'm going to try to explain it, and I'm sure I will fail, because it's Twin Peaks level out here.
This must be where pies go when they die.
Now, based on those clips, you'll forgive me for hearing them consistently and repeatedly saying survey of scholars, and that the book is a collection of where scholars are at, and who's who of where people are at, and that I took Gary at his word and assumed that he's actually done some kind of scholarly survey for the book, particularly when one of the big deal criterion for considering something a minimal fact is that it has around 90% consensus of scholars. Silly me, I thought you could only claim something had 90% consensus if you do a head count. But apparently vibes is good enough. So, when I spoke with Bart Ehrman shortly after the release of Volume 1, within the context of, at the time, lack of transparency about the book, is why I spoke about my understanding in this way. Which is Gary Habermas's book on the Resurrection Evidences, Volume 1. I don't know if you've heard of this book.
No. Volume 1. How many volumes will there be?
So there will be 4. First volume is the evidence of his minimal facts case. Second volume is responses to naturalistic claims. The third volume will be his research. So he interviewed 250 scholars. He will finally publish a detailed analysis of that. And volume 4 is just his personal musings. So we'll see. We'll see how it goes.
Consensus among whom?
Well, this is the trouble, is for decades now he's thrown these numbers out, but he has not allowed anyone to analyze who they are and what they answered. So allegedly in Volume 3, what we're going to get is the detailed surveys that he used to get to the data in Volume 1 and 2. So it's kind of backwards, but
among 250 people? Okay.
He says that they are scholars in inappropriate fields, whatever that means. So we'll all find out. We'll all find out in a year. I think there were enough caveats there. Allegedly in Volume 3, and we'll see how this goes, and we'll all find out in a year, to let everyone listening know that I'm not speaking authoritatively or with any kind of concrete knowledge of what Gary's future books might contain. I honestly thought that survey of scholars meant survey of scholars. Where did I get the number 250 from? I had heard Gary talking about his 140 to 200 questions, so I probably mixed that up thinking that was the ballpark of scholars. I don't know. Bart and I were chatting, and I was going by memory, not notes. I was mistakenly focused on this is a survey of scholars, not this is a list of questions. I did actually correct this conception in a later video, once I had more information. I'd been waiting with bated breath for what I understood, apparently mistakenly, what Volume 3 was going to be. I thought we were finally getting an enumeration of the bean counting that Gary has been peddling for years, promising the receipts later. So with that context of my pre-admitted misunderstanding, let's return to Gary's critique.
Ben said that third volume has just short of 8,000 footnotes.
Wow.
So when a particular critic that most of you know went on his program and said, oh, this is where Gary Habermas is going to tell us about his 250 people he interviewed for The Empty Tomb. That's what we're going to find in this third volume. I'm thinking to myself, right, 8,000 footnotes, 250 people. How does that work out?
Well, maybe math isn't your specialty, but if there were 8,000 footnotes from 250 people, we could just divide 8,000 by 250 to see that would be an average of 32 footnotes per person. In a 1,000-page book, that's not a crazy number. That's off by an order of magnitude or something. It just wasn't correct, but it was at least plausible. Now, just like Volume 2, the shipping of physical copies of Volume 3 to Canada is delayed from the rest of the world, so I don't have my copy yet. But this jab from Gary had me so curious that I just had to double purchase an ebook copy to find out how wrong I was. Now, hopefully it's obvious to you that the number of footnotes a book has tells us nothing at all about how many scholars were referenced in the book. Fortunately, the book itself does give us the precise answer because it has a handy author index that someone like me can simply count.
Ah, that's one. One bat. Two bats. Three fabulous flyers.
How many unique authors does Gary's Volume 3 reference? 558. That's twice as many as the number I pulled out of thin air. But 558 is a lot closer to 250 than it is to 8,000. Gary wanted to make me look silly, so he picked this giant number. Never mind that it was for an unrelated statistic. One could theoretically write a book with 8,000 footnotes and have all of those reference only one scholar. But let's hear more about which scholars made the cut.
I would define relevant fields as New Testament, theology, apologetics, philosophy, history, archaeology, classics. Not just anybody who sounds off on silly things.
That's me, by the way. I'm one of those anybody's, just sounding off about silly things.
It's a who's who of names across the board, and there are probably more skeptics, atheists, agnostics, Christian writers, let's say Jewish New Testament scholars. There are probably more non-Christians than Christians in the book.
Probably more non-Christians than Christians in the book. Now, 558 scholars is a lot of scholars, but it's not so many scholars that I can't go find out the self-proclaimed religions of each for those who have been public about such things. As far as I can determine, based on public record, Gary's got 2 agnostics, 4 ancient Greeks, presumably polytheistic, 12 atheists, 1 Buddhist, 4 deists, 14 Jews, and 1 self-proclaimed skeptic. 78 were unknown, undeclared, or just underdetermined. And that leaves 443 of Gary's scholars who self-identify as Christians. Because Gary didn't specify what kind of Christians he meant, I'm not going to split hairs on denominations. There are Anglicans, Baptists, Catholics, Episcopalians, Evangelicals, Lutherans, Methodists, Presbyterians, and even 3 Mennonites. Shout out to Philip Weeb, Gordon Kaufman, and Vernon Neufeld. And there's Gary himself, of course. Even if all 78 of those unidentified were part of the Church of Satan, that still means 79% of the authors referenced in Gary's book are Christians. 92% of the identified authors are Christians. So no, Gary, there aren't more non-Christians than Christians.
Didn't want to dog any of you evangelicals, but the point of my book was not to tell people about evangelicals. It was to tell people about non-evangelicals and how much agreement there is on these issues. I would say that's the theme of number 3.
That's what I wanted the theme of my 10th birthday party to be.
If that's the theme, it's completely lost on me. I thought the theme was, why does this book exist? And who is it for? And why did I spend $100? To avoid further poisoning the well with my own befuddlement, I'm going to turn this over to the pastor from Rev Reads, who seems genuinely excited about owning Volume 3.
This is the review where I have read a smaller percentage of the book that I am reviewing than any review I have done before on the channel. I always like to point out how I'm reading these books that I'm reviewing in their entirety. Well, I read all of On the Resurrection Volume 1. I read all of On the Resurrection Volume 2. But I've only read about 50 pages of On the Resurrection Volume 3 scholarly perspectives. And I'm not even going to apologize to Gary Habermas on this one for only reading this amount of the book, because unlike Volumes 1 and 2, this book is not meant to be read all the way through. And I hope that my review will let you know if you should purchase this book that you also will not read all the way through. What I didn't really realize, though, was that this book is basically a well-formatted, hence props to the editor on the cover, and well-edited collection of Gary Habermas's life work, of collecting the views of other scholars on the resurrection over decades of work. It is mostly a collection of, here are the scholars who believed that the disciples simply didn't know where the body of Jesus was located, and that was how the tales of the resurrection started. Casey notes this, Coakley writes that, Crossan makes this claim, Galvin mentions these views. So I can't imagine anyone, due to the nature of this book, anyone other than Benjamin Shaw reading it all the way through. Unless you're like Xerxes and you need something to read to help you to fall asleep before you go to bed. But at the same time, if you are doing research and study on the resurrection and you want to know the various views on this subject, so instead of you needing to search through who knows how many books to find the various views on the Roman guards posted at the tomb, the issues with the number of women at the garden, and go from book to book hoping to find who wrote on what, Habermas spent decades compiling all this information together, and it is now in one epic collection. So if anyone is doing serious research on the death and resurrection of Jesus, I couldn't imagine a resource that would be more helpful and more time-saving than this one.
You can't even imagine a more helpful and time-saving resource than this? Well, Rev Reads, I got some good news. The world no longer operates with card catalogs. We've got computers now. Let's go with Rev Reed's suggestion and look in Gary's book at which scholars write against the historicity of the guards at Jesus' tomb. Gary alerts us to Brown, William Lane Craig, Davis, Osborne, and Staudinger, along with various scholars. Now I could go find these footnotes and learn the titles of the books and page numbers. Let's compare that to the Logos Bible software, something anyone doing serious research on the resurrection probably already has access to. I ask it for scholars who think tomb guards are ahistorical, and voila! First, I get a synopsis telling me about William Lane Craig and some others up front. I'm seeing Staudinger there too, in the many dozens of results coming back. I'm also seeing Gary. His books are actually part of the dataset. On the plan I have, Logos is pulling from around 90,000 sources, not just the ones Gary read. Importantly, it found 2 passages from F. David Farnell from 2016 and one from Edward D. Andrews from 2017. Those are significant because these were explicitly excluded from Gary's book. As he writes in his introduction,
it's also important to note for readers with chiefly research interests that most of the sources referenced in this volume date before 2015, with more recent publications, even those written by already cited authors, being absent.
You heard that right. Volume 3 came out this month, and it's already 10 years out of date. I can ask the same question of the Perplexity search engine, and it has a similar consensus summary that Logos gave us, and identified William Lane Craig here too. It came up with Richard Carrier, Michael White, Helmut Koester, and John Wenham that Gary's book doesn't include. And since the LLMs have ingested humanities libraries, we checked ChatGPT, which found Brown from Gary's list, but is also adding Crossan, Ludeman, Allison, Ehrman, and Goulder. Some of these are the prominent and obvious non-Christian scholars he's bragging about including. Gary's 3rd volume may have some novel information, but no one should be relying on it as their only source. Spend your book money on a Logos subscription.
So it's not really apologetics. It's where an atheist New Testament scholar is on this. It's where a committed evangelical with a degree, a terminal degree in an acceptable area, where they are.
It is not apologetics. Gary's 1st volume claimed that he had 90% support for his minimal facts, and I assumed this volume was finally going to be Gary showing the math to back up his claims. Now it looks like his declarations of consensus will never be demonstrated.
Mostly Good Friday to the Ascension. How many questions can we ask, and where are these guys all the way across the board? And I purposely included non-Christians so that people wouldn't think this is a book from one of our evangelical schools and what we all think.
I'm going to try to keep an open mind and try to actually use it as a resource for my own resurrection book. But count me initially skeptical. This is an expensive book, so be forewarned that it's an index, not an argument or narrative that would be of interest to a regular person. I expect there will be more stops for Gary on his promotion tour.
Let's do a show on Volume 3. Let's get the word out there. So I'll be shooting you an email to talk about that.
So I'll have opportunity to let you know if my first impressions change with any future responses. I've been wrong before, and I'll be wrong again. But back to the panel. The 2.5-hour affair was primarily designed as an unabashed love fest for Gary, literally named Tribute to Gary Habermas.
My goodness, today we have probably what I think is going to be the best show I've ever done.
I'm not even sure I'd be a Christian today had you not spent that kind of time and helped me through it.
Wow, this guy's not only a brilliant scholar, but just takes time for people.
He's been persistent with this, and he's been so kind. I don't know how he can answer all of his emails and mentor so many people so closely.
Thank you so much. The Lord used you as his chosen instrument. And so thank you. Thank you. Love you, brother.
It made me wonder what an evangelical Bible scholar version of a Comedy Central roast would be like. For some reason, the host decided to ask each panelist what surprised them most from Gary's research. And he started with Gary.
Most surprising, I mean, as somebody who's lived in this subject, as somebody who I think I've never done anything but this topic, I would think I wouldn't be, that'd be a hard question to answer.
Gary wasn't surprised by something that demonstrated the resurrection is true, but rather that the resurrection is emotionally meaningful for people.
So I've gotten 2 letters from the editors back in the last week at B&H Academic. Here's what they said. Of your 4 volumes, 3 topics and 2 topics in volume 4, your last half of volume 4 is the most stunning part of the 4 volumes because it relates theology to practice. What does it say to the dying? What does it say to the doubting? What does it say about prayer and worship? What does it say about, and they both said in separate emails, it's easily the best portion of all 4 volumes is part 4, volume 4, 2. And it's not out, by the way, until next summer. They had to put the date back about 6 months, not me, but summer of 26 for volume 4. Guys, I'm going to tell you something. This thought I'm going to share with you is only about 3 days old in my mind. I'm thinking I love apologetics from the top of my head to the bottom of my toes. I'm all about it, and there's many people in the world who need it. Ben will tell you with his doubt ministry, there's many people who need to solve their emotions more than to solve their evidences. And since it is true, instead of saying over and over again, it's true, it's true, it's true, it's true, where does our commitment to the Lord come in? Where does the place of faith? How strong is faith, bracing what the facts say? That's about 3 days old. And I think that's their comment that was the most moving part of the book is shaking me up a little bit. Because now I want to, don't worry, I'm not going up to volume 5 for sure.
After 4,000 pages and 15 years of this magnum opus, I do wish there was something more novel about it than a final appeal to emotion.
One of the things that I guess surprised me, one of them is funny because it's the fact that Habermas types with 2 fingers, and you're wondering how can a guy who types with 2 fingers do 4,000 pages? That in and of itself is something of a miracle. Within our lifetimes, too.
None of them were surprised by any arguments in the book. I wasn't either.
For me personally, it's kind of comforting to see that there's nothing new under the sun.
Maybe which of the unsurprising arguments do they consider the best?
The argument that stands out the most is cumulative force. I mean that metaphorically, but also physically. When you drop those books down, there's a force to them. And then you find out there's a second book with it, and then a third, a fourth. I used to carry them around to show people the thickness. I'm just getting too tired carrying them. They're so big, and I get fatigued. That's why I try to work out just to carry the books.
Yes. Your research assistant on the project goes straight to the argument from page count.
I'll always remember Mike said when he went to ETS for the first time, InterVarsity was hawking Mike's book on the resurrection of Jesus, historiographic approach, and the guy from IVP was holding the 2 books up against each other and said, "Look at this. Mike's book is longer than Tom's book." And I guess that's the standard for which book is the best there.
Literally argument from page count. Though it sounds like Next Generation Ben wants to flip it to argument from reverse page count.
So I like doing the same thing with resurrection. I know 4,000 pages have already been written on it, but I think maybe I could do it a little bit different. At least I can do it shorter. I know I can do that.
Similar to argument from page count is the panel's argument from argument count.
Yeah, two things stood out to me, Gary. I feel like I've been waiting for decades for the 21 arguments for the empty tomb. Telling us that they're coming. You've hinted that there's about 24.
Gary is obsessed with numbering his points. This isn't good or bad, but everyone needs to remember that argument isn't a unit of persuasion. Not all arguments carry the same weight, or we wouldn't need juries. We just count to see if the defense or prosecution had made more arguments. But that isn't how it works. The burden of proof is on the prosecution. The defense doesn't need to make even a single argument to win. The defense can rest immediately and still be victorious. A bloody knife with fingerprints is more important than an ambiguous footprint a block away.
And I've always been wondering, well, what are they? When is he finally going to give them to us? And they're in this book, and I just love it. I haven't seen it anywhere else.
Maybe I'll cover this empty tomb list sometime, but there's nothing new except a bewildering numbering system. Empty tomb is section 4.1, section B, and that has 20 subpoints. So I think that's what he's talking about. But subpoint 2 is just called criteria, and criteria isn't an argument.
So to me, that's worth the price of the whole book, which is not cheap for the record, but it's worth it.
$100 for empty tomb bullet points like Jerusalem factor?
Okay, here's one. All right, you're 21 arguments for the empty tomb. That's in and they're all way constructed minimal factually by using arguments that critics allow, not by saying the tomb is empty because John 20 says so, period.
If the empty tomb points were minimal factuality, then you'd put them in the minimal facts list. In fact, the vast majority of these empty tomb points are indeed just gospel. Points like Peter and John investigated it, or empty tomb assumed in Acts.
I think one of the things is that the 6 minimal facts upon which I base a minimal case for the resurrection, I was surprised when I counted how many evidences there are for each of those facts, arrived at the way critics do, and not so, I go from big to small sometimes, but I don't mention the ones that are too small to even be mentioned. And those 6 facts had an average of 15 evidences per fact.
What does this even mean? No wonder apologists pluralize evidences. There isn't a unit of evidence for which each minimal fact has 15 evidence units. That's not how any of this works.
So when you talk about the empty tomb and you say 20, well, the empty tomb, it has a lot of data in its favor, but the other, it's not one of the minimal facts on my list. So on the other 6, average 15. They're behind the 20.
So the final score is empty tomb 20, minimal fact 15. Congratulations on being a Christian now, everyone.
And I was surprised when I added this up and found that many. So there were so many.
There were so many.
And I think what that means is when somebody comes up with naturalistic theory, they don't know how many things you might unleash at them because there's a lot of stuff.
That's what makes this difficult, and why cleaning up all the spaghetti you've thrown against the wall but did not stick is a full-time job. And we all know you're not going to stop throwing spaghetti.
Throw as much spaghetti against the wall as you can muster and see what sticks. Really get it up there.
Is there anything like that where or did the scholars just
No, I have not checked this out, so I don't want to take this. Dale Allison, Dale's a good buddy, but Dale, I'm telling people here, whoever hears it here, that I have only heard this as a rumor a couple places.
I don't know, Gary. Maybe you shouldn't say anything you haven't confirmed, even with caveats. I gave caveats about my 250 scholar thing, and I still got in trouble for it.
But I heard that Dale, in a recent dialogue, said that the minimal facts argument for the resurrection is the strongest argument for the resurrection.
So does that mean we're like the best of the worst?
Gary, you didn't just make that up because Dale came on my channel and gave my minimal witnesses hypothesis an A, did ya? So, if I was one of your students and presented this in class, what kind of grade would you give me on this?
Yeah, you get an A.
Dale gives me an A, And now you need to say Dale called yours the strongest argument?
When I say I made you, you gotta say you made me. And how childish can you get?
Don't be jealous, man. Dale does have the best resurrection book, and he famously concludes that the so-called evidence is indeterminate and that the believer and non-believer both are fully justified in their conclusions. So by giving either of us some praise, he's not saying either of us are actually fundamentally convincing. But he did give me the A first.
So, Gary, what is the greatest challenge to the claim of Christ's resurrection? And what is our response?
This is from the bottom of my heart. I do not think there's a great challenge for the resurrection that puts the fact of the resurrection in any kind of danger. I don't think there's an objection that, wow, if I'm in a debate, if I'm doing a podcast, I don't want to be asked this question.
Last time I got to ask you a question, you completely dodged it. And your friend Mike here had to try to make you answer, and you still never did.
If you're only going to count appearances to single individuals to get away from groups, I don't think that's fair. And the earliest account...
Well, I think it's fair. I mean, when we talk about answering hallucinations, one of the responses we give, group appearances.
Right.
So isn't it fair? It's fair for someone like Paulogia or someone to say, well, what percentage of scholars today in the field would grant the group appearances?
You can see my video on that exchange. Gary, it's easy for you not to be afraid of questions when you just don't answer them.
I'm not aware of anyone like that, but I'll tell you the most common one. I'll shift it just a little bit. I think our scholars have moved from maybe this happened, maybe that happened. And now almost none of the well-known scholars will take a naturalistic theory and will stand on it and say, here I stand. If I'm right, you're wrong. And if I'm right, Christianity's not true. I think there's a widespread fear that if they did that, they would be blown away.
We discussed this in my recent video about Rhett. That while he does have his own notion of what might have happened, the evidence is so underdeterminate that a myriad of naturalistic explanations remain plausible and viable options with not enough concrete data to actually prefer one over the other. That's not a weakness. If there's a forest fire with no obvious evidence as to the cause, authorities are justified and honest in saying, we don't yet know what started the fire, but we're almost certain it wasn't dragons.
Naturalistic theories, one of them, they're not around, but I think this is the biggest objection. This is not a supernatural world. Those things don't happen. That's not the world we live in. I haven't seen a resurrection. You haven't seen a resurrection. You can say whatever you want, but I don't see any reason to believe in something like that.
Naturalistic hypotheses don't require an anti-supernatural worldview to be considered the most likely explanation for the origin of Christianity. The entire case is based on alleged testimony, and testimony alone is always going to be more likely to be mistaken or a lie than to affirm something supernatural. That sentence is true even if you 100% believe in the supernatural and miracles. It's not flat denial. It's just requiring something more than testimony.
It's too young to say we're post-resurrection, but he thinks the resurrection research has been done. It's established. Nobody's picking the major theories anymore.
Game over, man. It's game over.
People like Bauckham and Hurtado and Tom Wright and others, they've won the day.
That's it. We did it.
We did it!
Let's say the resurrection happened. Let's say the critics have abandoned their goofy stuff.
I can assure you that I have not abandoned goofy stuff.
And let's march forward as a kingdom.
I think I'm the only one who's ever spoken about this, but in resurrection research, nobody's ever gotten into this area in philosophy called the epistemology of testimony, where there's a reductionist position versus an anti-reductionist perspective and stuff like that.
Well, that sounds promising. Is one of you finally going to admit that it's a testimony problem and not a worldview problem?
Do we trust a source when they say something, or do we start skeptical? Is the burden of proof on them that it's true, or is it the burden on proof? And they lean towards it's true if someone makes the claim. And so, which is is fine. It's hard for me to say one has to take one approach or the other, but I do think you got to start making a case either way you go.
If you mean that you need to start making a case that isn't just prima facie believing testimony, then I agree. That should be the next frontier of resurrection defense. Find a version of this that is justified beyond straight up credulity.
My bigger issue is there's a lot of concernment about saying miracles happened or addressing those sorts of things. And so if that's even in the discussion, then that kind of stops it.
Correct. Resurrection discussion just stops there. Excellent observation.
I think historians should be able to say miracles happened. And a lot of times you'll hear people say, oh, historians can't say a miracle happened. We don't have the tools. But I see a lot of historians writing about economics, about political theory, about war. Last time I checked, they weren't generals, but they're writing history about war. So you don't have to be a specialist in these fields to make those sorts of comments.
Maybe you don't actually understand your underlying problem here, Ben. When people say the tools of a historian can't affirm a miracle, they mean that the methods and principles used in historical research are inherently limited to evaluating natural events, those that follow regular patterns of human behavior, cause and effect, and physical laws. One does not need to be a general to be aware that war follows regular patterns of human behavior, cause and effect, and physical laws, or to be aware that war is happening every single day and is sadly an incredibly unsurprising and mundane thing to observe. Miracles, on the other hand, are some sort of interference in regular patterns, cause and effect, and physical laws. That's the opposite, and why the tools of a historian are insufficient to determine this, no matter how sad it makes you. Just as the tools of a hockey player are insufficient to build a house. They're just the wrong tools.
The last one I plan on writing will be on the historical reliability of the Gospels. That's something I've worked on for a little bit already. I'm still working on it now. So, and reliability from a little different perspective than what has been written before. So it'd be like, well, what do we mean by the term reliable? We have to get to some foundation thoughts. What do we mean by reliable? How do we quantify it? What kind of criteria do we have that will, fairly work for not only, it's got to work across the board. If we're going to talk about the Gospels, it's also got to be the same criteria we would apply to the ancient historical and biographical literature. So we're not preferring the Gospels in some kind of sense or prejudicing for their historical reliability. They've got to be fair criteria that need to be met. So that's what I want to work on.
If anyone has a chance to write a book that convinces me of gospel reliability, it's probably Mike Licona. In his previous books, he's been willing to say that Jerusalem zombies probably weren't historical. His most recent book was an excellent study explaining how features of the Gospels are best understood as literary conventions. And he's been in whole battles against the undesigned coincidences crowd. I, for one, can't wait to read it and have Gary never consider it because it's too new.
What would be your recommendation for these who are zealous to defend the Christian faith, but they really want to start learning about the resurrection? What would be the best beginner's book, in your opinion?
This could get awkward because all the scholars on the panel have contributed to resurrection books.
An old-time book, first of all. James Orr's book, The Resurrection of Jesus. A brilliant book and a brilliant treatment of naturalistic theories from 1908, as I recall.
Wow.
Wow is right. No wonder Gary didn't care about anything newer than 2015. He thinks resurrection scholarship peaked 117 years ago. This book came out 10 years before physicians started investigating shell shock, 20 years before Hans Konzelmann began isolating creedal formulas in the New Testament, 40 years before experiments on social contagion of beliefs, and 60 years before Rees made his breakthrough in grief hallucinations.
And he's got 2 long chapters, and maybe the most virulent comebacks from skeptics, one on hallucinations, in which he also handles objective vision, the Theodor Keim theory, but visionary views, especially hallucination. Now remember, this is 08.
How can he possibly be authoritative on hallucination before humanity even began the science on it? Will Gary also at least recommend something from within his lifetime? Maybe a book from one of the panelists?
And if you want to move a lot closer to the present, there are other books that have maybe better reputation. I some of the books and put them down, but some of the known ones, the better known ones on the resurrection are not all that insightful, and I wouldn't recommend them today.
It's my book or no book at all.
You know, it's always in danger when you start naming people and folks are sitting here.
Indeed.
By the way, Sean, I just saw your book cited yesterday by a critic who says only we are the most four apostles we have good data for. And so why do you say this about the 12?
Is he talking about me again? Or was this some in-person conversation he had? The wording doesn't make sense either way. But I did just put out a disciple martyr video as this posted that matches the description.
When I say you never heard me say the other 12 are provable, I try to tell my students never to say that.
What you need to stop inferring through deliberately vague language is that all 12 saw risen Jesus and proclaimed he was alive. Can you stop doing that?
But I said, why don't you listen to what Sean said in that book? Who are the ones for sure? And we've got Peter and Paul and James, the brother of Jesus.
Yep, I accept those. Into the minimal witness hypothesis.
But those three guys are big. Who's the most influential guys in the early church? Peter and James and Paul. And
right.
all died for their faith? Yes, they died for their faith. They didn't recant. Nope, they didn't recant.
James was a political grudge murder, and Peter and Paul were killed by Nero as a cover-up. None of the killers cared about what they believed or whether they would recant. You can make this recanting thing a talking point if you can ever demonstrate they were given a chance to recant. Until then, it means nothing.
He was trying to say that Sean's only going to give me three, and I said, well, pay attention to the three Sean gave you.
I do.
Do you think there's anybody else worth bringing back in again beyond those three?
Great question. I have just finished a second edition, a 10-year update, and have slightly reassessed 5 of the apostles. I now think 3 of them died naturally: John, Matthew, and Philip.
Ouch, everyone. That brings it down to 9 of the 12 at even the most credulous thresholds.
I lowered down James, the son of Zebedee, in part because you said you've really got one source as reliable as it is. And I was like, you know what? Gary's right on this one. I think I'm overstating it a little bit.
Gary is the one that convinced you that Acts as a single source should lower your confidence? That's amazing. Thank you, Gary.
And I don't see any prospect of another apostle moving in there that I could find.
Hey, wait a minute. Dale, if you put the shroud at 72.5 or whatever you said, what do you put the historical argument alone for the resurrection? Not your faith. Where do you put the argument for the historical argument for the resurrection? What number?
It was actually lower than the shroud. It was around in the 66%.
How much?
It was around the 66% range.
Just so I'm clear, you're 72% sure that the Shroud of Turin is real, but only 66% sure of the historical argument for the resurrection.
It was actually.
I remember you telling me over and over, Gary, I only have to get past 50 because 50 is the break-even point.
Yeah.
So if it's 52 when I'm done, I'm going to believe in the resurrection because it beats the alternative.
Wow. So Gary Habermas managed to get you to 52% sure of the resurrection. So you went all in and threw him a tribute party to thank him. In U.S. courts, they have a beyond reasonable doubt standard for criminal cases. The resurrection can't meet that. For you, Jesus needs to have his hearing as a civil case where the lower standard is just preponderance of the evidence. Just 51% more likely true than not. That's where the resurrection is living now? I thought Gary declared resurrection the victorious worldview, and that Christians don't even need to bother defending it anymore from silly people like me.
Okay, well, I converted overall the positive and all the negative evidences combined. I got at 53.14% that Christianity's true. So I converted on the 53%.
Wow. The greatest resurrection scholar alive today personally took you under his wing. And after all the hours and the mentoring, you got to 53.14% chance the resurrection happened?
I just remember we went back there and you were going, I'm just aiming for a 51.
Looks like Low Bar Bill might have some company.
And I'm not kidding. I thought, if there is just one chance in a million that this is true, it's worth believing. And so my attitude toward this is just the opposite of Kyle's. Far from raising the bar or the epistemic standard that Christianity must meet to be believed, I lower it.
Obviously, we didn't cover everything from the Apologist Love Fest, but I think that was the high points. Thank you so much for watching, and thank you so much to my patrons and members who support the mission of this channel and make videos like this possible. If you can join them, that would be greatly appreciated. For more, tap on the thumbnail on screen now, and I'll see you over there. Until next time, later.